Okay.
Okay. Ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay.
Okay.
Moshe Soloveichik will now give a shir.
Yeah. Okay. First, I want to mention that next Sunday I will not be able to give the shir. So consequently, I will discuss the Sedra, Devarim. I will discuss the 3 weeks, and I will discuss I will discuss also the Shiva and the Nechemta. I will try to include all 3 things in the share. Of course, in the following week when I give the share, so I will continue on discussing the Shiva and the Nechemta. But in other words, we have first the 3 weeks. The 3 weeks are weeks to some degree of mourning, where the custom is to refrain from public festivities. We don't take Ashkenazic Jews don't take haircuts, and there are a number of other forms of display of mourning over the loss of the Beis Hamikdash. But it all begins with Shabbos B'Tammuz. And then we have the 9 days, which will start this coming week, next week, in the Wednesday, Rosh Chodesh Av. And the 9 days, there's more intense mourning. We refrain from eating meat and drinking wine. And that leads us up to Tisha B'Av. And that leads us up the following week to Tisha B'Av. And then we excuse me, Rosh Chodesh this week, Tuesday. I'm sorry, it's 9 days. And then the following Thursday, and the following week is Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, of course, is the day of intense mourning. And then we have the 7 weeks of consolation, the Shiva de Nechemta, the 7 weeks of Nechama. And we have special Haftorahs. And the question is raised, and I've raised it many times. I have a number of answers. I will discuss one of those answers today. Probably in the coming weeks, I will discuss some of the other answers. Why is it that when it comes to mourning period, we have 3 weeks of mourning period, but when it comes to Nechama, when it comes to the consolation, there are 7 weeks of consolation? Why was it necessary to add extra weeks of consolation over and above the number of weeks that are used for days of mourning? Now, the 3 weeks. The 3 weeks begins with the fast of Shabbos B'Tammuz, and there is a dispute. We know what happened in Shabbos B'Tammuz. In Shabbos B'Tammuz, the enemy penetrated the walls of Yerushalayim. They entered the area of Yerushalayim, and it took them 3 weeks to destroy the Beis Hamikdash. They had a fight. They had a fight to get to the Beis Hamikdash. The Kohanim resisted every inch of space. They fought with the enemy, whether it was the Babylonian enemies or it was the enemies from Rome and the second Beis Hamikdash. But ultimately, they reached the Beis Hamikdash. They acted in an inappropriate manner in the Beis Hamikdash, and then they set the Beis Hamikdash aflame. Now, but the question is the event that commemorates the enemy entering the borders of Yerushalayim, penetrating the walls of Jerusalem. When did that happen? Now, in the second Beis HaMikdash, everybody said that happened on the 17th of Tammuz. The Gemara says, how do we know it? The Gemara says we know it because of the Masorah. It was something that was given over from generation to generation. But the question is, when did it happen, this fast day that commemorates the destruction, the enemy entering the area of Jerusalem, penetrating the walls of Jerusalem? When did it happen in the first Beis HaMikdash? At the time of the first Churban, at the time of the first exile. According to the Bavli, it happened on the 9th of Tammuz, not the 17th of Tammuz. But nevertheless, we observe the fast day on the 17th of Tammuz because that's when it happened in the second Beis HaMikdash. However, Yerushalmi says something very, and why does the Bavli say that in the first Beis HaMikdash it happened on the 9th of Tammuz? Because the Navi writes that it happened on the 9th of Tammuz. The Yerushalmi, however, says no. The Yerushalmi says the enemy penetrated the borders of Jerusalem, broke through the walls of Jerusalem in both Batei Mikdash on the 17th of Tammuz. So if that's the case, the Yerushalmi asked the question, so why is it that the Navi, the prophet, when he talks about how the enemy attacked Jerusalem, mentioned that they entered Jerusalem in the time of the first temple on the 9th of Tammuz? And the Yerushalmi answers that the reason it happened is the reason the Navi wrote the 9th of Tammuz, when according to Yerushalmi in both Batei Mikdash, in both the temples, the enemy entered on the 17th, was Bilbul Cheshbonos Yeshkan, that the people were so confused that they got the day wrong. The enemy actually entered on the 17th of Tammuz. But the people were so confused because of the sorrows, because of the tragedies that were taking place, that the people thought it was the 9th of Tammuz. I know when I was in the emergency room with my son, Sol Yosef, who passed away when there was times of crises. I didn't know when was day and I didn't know when was night. And that when this happens over a period of a number of days, this can cause confusion. So the Navi wrote that it happened on the 9th of Tammuz, because the people at that time thought, the people in Jerusalem thought that was in the 9th of Tammuz. But according to the Yerushalmi, it actually happened on the 17th of Tammuz. But we have to understand it's very difficult. How is it possible that the Navi will write something that wasn't true? True, the people were mistaken. But the facts were, it happened on the 17th of Tammuz. And the Navi had Ruach HaKodesh. He certainly knew what the right date was. So why in giving the details of the event does he mention the date that the people thought rather than the date that it actually happened? And the way everybody explains it, it's because the Navi wants us to, in a sense, experience, in a sense, to re-experience the position of the Jewish people at that time. And that we should, in a sense, feel ourselves as being part of Jerusalem. When Jerusalem was under siege, when the walls were being broke into. In a sense, to have those same feelings, the same confusion that the people in Jerusalem had. But nevertheless, according to Yerushalmi, even after the first Churban, the tiniest, the fast day, was on the 17th of Tammuz. So on one hand, the Navi wants us to, in a sense, identify with the feelings and the perspective that the people had at that time. To re-experience the way they understood it. But on the other hand, when we commemorate the tragedy, we commemorate in accordance with the day that it actually happened. And not just today, after the second Churban, according to the Yerushalmi, this is what was observed. This was what was observed after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. Now, a matter of fact, this same approach, I think, is very clear when we look at this week's Sedra. This is Parshas Devarim, and Parshas Devarim, to a large degree, Moshe Rabbeinu, certainly the beginning of Chumash Devarim, Moshe Rabbeinu is recalling to the Jewish people before he dies the events that took place while they were traversing the desert. How time and time again, they rebelled against HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and how time and time again their actions brought tragedy upon tragedy, to the degree that instead of spending a little more than 1 year in the desert, they had to spend 40 years in the desert. 40 years of traversing the Midbar. And in Chumash Devarim this week, Torah says, "Vaytikru elai kulchem." You all came to me, and you said, "Let us send men ahead of us, and let them spy out the land and bring word back to us, the road we should ascend and the cities to which we should come." The idea was good in my eyes. And I took from you 12 men, and we know the tragedy that happened when the spies came back and gave this negative report about the land of Israel. So the it seems from this week's Sedra, that whose idea was it to send spies that ultimately led to this tragedy of the Jewish people having to be in the desert for 40 years? It was the idea presented by the Jewish people. And who accepted it? Moshe Rabbeinu accepted the idea. However, if you take a look at Parshas Shlach, when the event actually happens, so the Torah says, "Shlach lecha vayirav Hashem Moshe leimor shlach lecha anashim." God says to Moshe, "Send out It seems that it was a command from God. It wasn't the idea of the Jewish people. It wasn't something that appealed to Moshe after the Jewish people suggested it, as this week's Sedra seems to suggest. But in Parsha Shalach, it seems that it was a command. And this question was already asked by our sages. And our sages give an answer. They say the expression shlach lecha, send for you. In other words, God told Moshe, if you want, send. If you feel that it's proper to send, send. But God didn't command the Jewish people to send. God did not command Moshe Rabbeinu to send spies. After they requested, God gave consent. So, but it's very strange. But the simple reading gives two completely different versions. Okay, we have a drasha, but there are two completely different versions given in Parsha Shlach and given in Parsha Devarim. The simple reading of Parsha Shlach, especially if someone doesn't have in his Chumash Parsha Devarim, he would say it was a command from God. And in Parsha Devarim, nowhere does it appear that it was a command from God. It was the Jewish people who suggested it, not just suggested it, but requested it. And it found favor in Moshe's eyes. Why did the Torah write it over in such a way? Almost contradictory. But just like in regard to the seizure of Jerusalem, just like in regard to the invasion of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, according to the Yerushalmi, the Torah wanted us to sense, to feel as they did. When we read the Torah literally, without commentary, as to what happened in the Midbar, in the desert, it's to give us an impression. What was the impression of the people at that time? Very often, when people get a heter for something, and unfortunately this is happening more and more, time and time again, when they get a heter, even when it's a legitimate heter, and certainly when it's a non-legitimate heter, which is most of the cases, the people are not happy with just getting permission. They want to have religious fervor in following the leniency and the heter that they received. So there's this tendency to want to turn the heter into a mitzvah, almost into a requirement. We see today things that the Torah considered and explicitly stressed were abominations. It's not enough that the rabbis allow it, although that's bad enough. But there are some rabbis who even chas v'sholem turn it into a mitzvah. Yes, God said, I told you it's a good land. I told you it's a good land. You really don't have to send Meraglim. But I'm giving you permission. The same way as God gave permission to Bilam. Even though initially God warned Bilam not to go with the Sarei Balak. But when he persisted, I should say. So God said, go. But remember what you're supposed to do. And of course, Bilam attempted to do what he was not supposed to do. That was the same story with the Jewish people. But the Torah wants us to, in a sense the attitude that the Jewish people had at that time, to make us aware what was their perspective. Perhaps that we should learn not to commit that same error. And I want to suggest that the fact that the Jewish people, according to Yerushalmi, didn't know what the date was, it means they lost contact with reality. When a person is tested to see if he still has contact with reality, or his confusion is so great that he loses contact with reality, one of the first questions after they ask him, what's his name? One of the first questions he's asked is, what day is it? What month is it? What day of the week is it? I think the Torah wants us to understand that the source of many problems is that we lose contact with reality. Take a look. In Chumash Bamidbar, which are the weeks, goes into the first 2 weeks of the 3 weeks, and shortly before that, what do we read about? We read about Korach. We read about the Meraglim. We read about the Rashi Sanhedrios who were with Korach, leaders of Klal Yisrael, leaders of the Jewish people, not just fools, but people of position. And in those days, they got position because of their ability. And they, after seeing Kriyas Yamsuf, they, after seeing everything that happened in the Midbar, after seeing Matan Torah, after seeing all the miracles, they lead rebellions against God, against Moshe Rabbeinu. Why is it that way? Because, as I mentioned before in this year, Kina, Taiva, and Kavod, Motzina, Sodom, and Olam, as the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says. Jealousy, desire, the drive for honor takes a person out of the world. What does it mean, takes a person out of the world? Some say it means you lose. Yechelik olam haba can lead a person to lose some of his olam haba, all of his olam haba. But I think there's a simple shot. Motzinas adam and olam, that you lose contact with reality. Desperation, when people are in desperate states, they have a tendency to lose contact with reality. And sometimes losing contact with reality either puts us on the path of sin or takes us off the path of sin. Or, prevents us from leaving the path of sin. Now, so I want to suggest that part of the idea of Shavasam and Tammuz a Tisha B'Av, some Gedalion Asar B'Teves, is to take us out of our ongoing situation. Because very often, when we are in our ongoing situation, the regular situation continues. We fail to see reality. We go with the flow. And if we sinned before, we continue to sin. And we have to rise above the situation that led us to sin in order to properly evaluate and to come to recognize the error of our ways. In the Tochacha, we're told time and time again that because of our sins, so many terrible things happen. We go to Golos, we go to exile. The tragedies that will take place when we go to exile, the personal tragedies that will take place, all of which have happened already. And what do we say? How do we react to it? Coincidence, Terry, it just happened. Mikra. It happened. What's the idea? The idea is we try not to think. And when we try to think, we try to think of excuses why there's no relationship with our situation in Golos, with the fact that we sin. There is a disconnect. There is a denial. We ignore reality. And worse than that is sometimes when we see Golos, when we see exile, we begin to think that exile is better than when we had the Beis Hamikdash. I remember a certain scholar gave a speech, talking to his class, and he had learned by one of the leading rabbinical figures, great Talmidei Chachamim in Europe. And when his Rabbi died, and he was a devoted student, he said something to the effect that it's much easier for him now, because now he could say whatever he wants. And I've seen rabbis that when they explain how they're deviating from the path of their rebellion, it's with a firm approach. I have to listen to my Rabbi, but my Rabbi died. So I can do whatever I want. So the idea is we look for excuses, and we even sometimes turn them into mitzvos. Excuses how to sin. So what is the purpose of the fast days? The fast days, in a sense, is a break of the natural continuum of our life. It's not olam timinhaga no way. There's something different. We withdraw from the situation that existed before. It gives us a chance to think and to come to sense what reality is. I think this is the purpose, one of the purposes of the 4 fast days. The purposes of the 4 fast days is to be able to come in contact with reality after having lost contact with reality. It's the loss of contact with reality that gave us the ability to sin, that gave us the ability to continue on the path of sin and to deny the trouble that we had because of the sin. And sometimes it even gives us the ability, denying reality gives us the ability to turn the sin into a mitzvah. Now, the Rambam in Hilchos Tainis, in Perek Aleph of Hilchos Tainis, he says that he says, first he talks, the Rambam, the first 4 prakim of Hilchos Tainis, the first 4 chapters of the laws of fast days. He talks about the mitzvah that when an enemy attacks us, we have to proclaim a fast day. And we have to cry out to God. And we have to have the Skenim, the elders, the rabbis, sit with us and evaluate our ways. And he says, "V'hu midarkei hatshuva." This is part of the pathway of tshuva. However, in Perek Hey, in the 5th chapter of Hilchos Tainis, so there the Rambam says, Yesham Yamim. There are certain days, Shekol Yisrael Misanim Behem, that all the Jews fast on them, because of the tragedies, the trouble that took place on those days. Kidei la'orer halavavos, to inspire our hearts. L'toach darkei tshuva, to open the pathway of tshuva. V'zeh yihye zeh zikaron l'maseinu haroim u'ma'asav aseinu hashaya k'maseinu. And this will remind us, it will serve as a reminder of our deeds and the deeds of our ancestors. In other words, as our sages tell us, that any generation the Beis HaMikdash is not rebuilt, the Beis HaMikdash would have been destroyed. The reason the Beis HaMikdash in these 2,000 years was not rebuilt was because our deeds were like the deeds of our ancestors at that time. So, but it's interesting, when the Rambam talks, when Maimonides mentions a fast day because of an impending tragedy, the enemy at the gate, the famine that's taken place, the crops that are being destroyed. The Rambam says the purpose of the fast, we fast, why? Midarkei hatshuva. That's part of the path of doing tshuva. However, when he talks about the 4 fast days of Shavos B'Tammuz, Tisha B'Av, Tzom Gedalia, and Asar B'Teves, then he doesn't say it's fasting is part of the path of tshuva. He says it's to open up the door to the path of tshuva. It's very interesting. I heard from my father that at one time there was great oppression of the Jews in Russia, the time of the Chavetz Chaim. And at that time, the Chavetz Chaim proclaimed it as a fast day, that all the Jews should fast because of the situation that the Jews in Russia find themselves in. And my great-grandfather, Reb Chaim, he felt that they should not make a public fast day. He said individuals could fast. Why? He says, because the fulfillment of the fast day is in doing tshuva, in repenting. And unfortunately, he felt that at that time, the Jewish people wouldn't do tshuva, wouldn't repent, wouldn't change their ways drastically, maybe for 1 or 2 days. So the question is, according to Reb Chaim, why do we fast on Shavuos Tammuz? Why do we fast on Tisha B'Av? But the answer is, Tisha B'Av is not doing Shuvah. Shavuos Tammuz is not to do Shuvah. Tisha B'Av and Shavuos Tammuz is to evaluate, is for us to recognize that we are in trouble. When the enemy is at the gate, when there's a famine, when there is no food, we all know that we're in trouble. The problem about Golus, the problem about exile, is that we lose contact with reality. And we don't feel how insecure we are. Who felt more secure prior to World War II than the Jews in Germany? But overnight, that security crumbled. The Jews of Germany felt they live in a cultured nation. They have nothing to worry about. Golus, to many of them, might have been a pleasant experience. But overnight, they found out what Golus really means. But they were not prepared for it. Why? Because there was a denial in reality. There's a denial in reality. And that's the problem. And the few things that happen, we tend to say it's a coincidence. It doesn't have anything to do with exile. It doesn't have anything to do with our sins. Tisha B'Av comes to remind us that Golus is not a good thing. Now, so I think that's what the Rambam is telling. Now, and it's very interesting. We find similar, I think a similar idea could be expressed in regard to a pasuk, the beginning of the Hillim. Ashrei ish asher lo halach basash v'shoim, u'v'derech hatan lo amad, u'v'moshav leitzim lo yoshav. Blessed is the one who does not go in the path of the in the advice of the wicked, and he doesn't stand in the path of the sinners, and doesn't sit with the scoffers. And there's a strange Meiri, the Meiri on Tehillim, he cites, might be a Medrash, I don't remember. He says the following thing: if a person goes in the path of the Rishayim, if he in the advice of Rishayim, so Sofo, his end will be he will stand in the path of sinners. And if he stands in the path of sinners, he will sit together with scoffers. Seems very strange. When we say Aveira Goreris Aveira, that one sin causes another sin. So it usually goes from something more not as stringent to something more stringent. You don't start off with the most stringent things. And here it's the reverse. Who is the worst? The wicked is the worst. And then is the sinner. And then let's a scoffer. Okay, he's not productive, but he isn't wicked. It seems to be the opposite. But I think what the Miri perhaps means to say is, what happens? Sometimes we recognize that certain people are Rishayim, are wicked. But for whatever reason, we want to have a limited relationship with them. And the thought enters our mind, hey, maybe they will have a bad influence on us. Just maybe. So I will not walk on their advice. I will not follow their advice. I will get their advice. But my encounter will be like one of walking. When you pass somebody by, you just pass them by. You don't even stop. There's no togetherness. But then what happens? It's not that he becomes better. It's not that I necessarily have an influence on him. But my mind, after I pass him by a number of times, and he says a few words to me, gives me a little advice, I get used to my relationship with him. In my mind, he changes. He's no longer a Russia. He's no longer a wicked person. He's a sinner, but he's not a wicked person. And then so I have more contact with him. And I stand. I don't just pass him by. I stand in his road. We're able to have conversations. And then after I get used to him, that's the normal sense. So I say, he's not really a sinner. He's not productive. He doesn't lead an exemplary form of life. He's a let's have some fun together. And I become one like him. I sit together with him. All this is based on our perception. What is it? It's the lack of contact with reality. We create our own reality in our minds because we want to. And I would suggest that at least unconsciously, and more than unconsciously, it's not only that we want a relationship with him, we want to create a situation that we shouldn't recognize the problem so we could do the exact same things that he does. We want to become part of that environment. We want to become part of that environment. And when we become part of that environment, it comes easy for us to act as they do. What is that? That's the lack of contact with reality. Because we want to lose our contact with reality because of ourselves. In order to enable that, we lose contact with reality concerning our perspective of them. And it's interesting. The Medrash in the Medrash in Anecha says, Eicha Yashva B'dad. How did this happen? That the city of Jerusalem should be like this, lose its children, be in a state of destruction. How did this city that was the greatest city in the world, how did it come that way? Eicha. And the Medrash points out, and many Darshanim point out, that the word Eicha is the same words as Ayeka in Bereshis. When Adam Arishon, Adam and Eve committed the sin, and they tried to hide from God, and the sound of God figuratively going through the garden, calls out Adam and Rishon and to Chava, and says, Ayeka, where are you? And of course, there are all kinds of explanations. Ayeka, Rashi explains it one way. But the Gra says, look, where are you? You were on such a high level. And now, as a result of the sin, you have fallen. Ayeka. I think the idea, and in other words, if it's Ayeka, if we're trying to hide from God, if we're embarrassed before God because of our sins, why did we sin? We sinned because we didn't think of God. We thought only of ourselves. So, Ayeka, where are you? If we don't respond to Ayeka, where you are, if we don't recognize who we have become and who we were before the sin, and who we became after the sin, we will not do tshuva. Even on the Barishon, when God confronts him, he looks for excuses. He tries to disassociate himself from the sin. One of the biggest hindrances to doing tshuva is denial, losing contact with reality. Why? We go with the flow. We just keep on doing. Change is difficult. We lose contact with reality. If we notice something for 1 minute, 2 minutes later, the lesson is gone. The Torah tells us when Korach had his rebellion and the earth opened up and swallowed Korach and his followers. The people ran away, they got scared. They saw the way God was acting, the way the sinners were being punished. But Vayihim Machras, it was the next day. And being the next day, it was able for them to push aside the events, to push aside what happened. It wasn't because Korach sinned. It was because Moshe and Aaron killed them. They saw all these things, but that's the way it is. We want things to be a certain way, so we make believe they are that way. It's very interesting. We have two viduis, Yom Kippur. One vidui, Shamno, Bagadno, Gozalno, Dibarno, Dofi. And the second vidui is Al Chaychcha Tunnel Fanecha, the long vidui, the sin that we did. And they talk specifically about the sin. The first video talks about us, who we have become. We came Gazlanim. It focuses on the individual. It emphasizes, Ayeka, where are you now? We have trouble associating ourselves with sin because we don't want to see ourselves as sinners. But the first thing that we have to do in the tshuva process is recognize that we sinned. I remember there were some people that I was acquainted with that would sometimes come to attend lectures that I gave. And they asked me, and they were not of the Orthodox movement. And they asked me, how is it? That's when the Baal Teshuva movement was very strong. Unfortunately, the Baal Teshuva movement today is considerably weaker. And they asked me, how is it that in their movements, there is no Baal Teshuva movement? Why is it that only the Orthodox are able to have a Baal Teshuva movement? And my response was that in order to do tshuva, you have to have sinned. And if you don't believe in sin, then you can't do tshuva. If you're not able to see yourself as being a sinner, if there is an excuse for everything, and excuses could be true, but nevertheless, I did what I did. And there is no one that doesn't sin. But we try to disassociate ourselves from the sin that we did. So because of that, we can't do tshuva. So now the linkage of the Haftorahs, the Shiva Nechemta, the 7 days that come after Tisha B'Av. So Tisha B'Av, the idea of Tisha B'Av, the idea of the 3 weeks, is to face reality, to see Golos, to see what our deeds did. And why is it when it comes to death, Avelus is after? First you have the Avelus of Shiva, then you have the Avelus of Shloshim, then you have the Avelus of Shana. But when it comes to mourning over the Beis HaMikdash, mourning over Golus, we start first with the 3 weeks. Then we start with the 9 days. Then we start with the week of Tisha B'Av. And then we have Tisha B'Av. It goes in the reverse order. Why is it that way? My uncle says, Avelus Yeshana, Avelus Chadasha. I want to add one point. We are not just sitting Avelus over the tragedy, the event that happened to the Beis HaMikdash, to the Eitzim V'Avonim, to the stones and the wood that made the Beis HaMikdash. We are mourning ourselves, our deeds. We have to recognize what brought about the Churban. And to realize that today, if the Beis HaMikdash was not rebuilt, then it's a sign that we are in the same situation. And we have to realize what Golus is, what exile is. But then when we come to this realization on Tisha B'Av, we begin to think it's hopeless. I'm a sinner, I'm lost. There is no choice. So we have the Shiva Nechemta, in which God appears to us and God tells us that the Shiva Nechemta, God appears to us and he says, not only I'll accept your tshuva, there's hope. Not only hope, there's a commitment. that the Jewish people will do tshuva overnight. Didn't we see the fall of the Soviet Union overnight? They're rebuilding themselves. That's because of the fault of others. Didn't we see the establishment of the state of Israel after the Holocaust almost overnight? It goes from bad to good overnight. So overnight, and Ein Yisrael Negolen El B'Tshuva, the Jewish people will only be redeemed with tshuva. So the Jewish people were redeemed with tshuva because they can and will do tshuva. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do tshuva. He wants to restore that relationship, and that's the whole Shiva Nechemta. And what does the Shiva Nechemta lead up to? The Shiva Nechemta leads up to Rosh Hashanah and to the Aseret Yemei Tshuva. I want to suggest something. My uncle says that the Shiva Nechemta and the 3 weeks, they're part of the observance of Tisha B'Av. They're part of the observance of Tisha B'Av. I want to say something more that, of course, it's part of the observance of Tisha B'Av. But the 3 weeks, Tisha B'Av, and the Shiva Nechemta, the 7 weeks of consolation, it's not just that they're part of Tisha B'Av. All of them are part of Rosh Hashanah. They're part of the Aseret Yemei Tshuva. The idea of Tisha B'Av is we have to face reality. And then we have to realize, in spite of how bad it seems, things will be better, can be better. And we have to make them better. And that's where Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim and the 10 days come in. That's what we have to understand. What is Tisha B'Av? Tisha B'Av is recognizing reality. We have to see how we didn't recognize reality when we sinned, how we persisted in not seeing reality, and that's why the Beis Hamikdash was not rebuilt. And then we have to deal with the reality and recognize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to help us to return. And that leads us to Rosh Hashanah, the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, and Yom HaKippurim. That's what we have to understand. It's not something isolated. That's why the Shiva Nechemta, the 7 weeks of consolation is 7 weeks. It's 7 weeks in order to connect it with Rosh Hashanah. Okay.
Hey, thank you, Moshe. Questions, please, in the chat. Right. Only once. Moshe, the shiur was so brilliant. All questions have been answered.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So, next week there will not be a shiur, but the following Sunday, there will be a shiur, and we'll send out notices just to reaffirm that.
Okay, I'm going to shut off the recording now.
Okay, fine.